The dust settled in layers, a fine red powder that coated Clara's eyelashes and filled the cracks in her lips. For 6 days, the mail coach had rocked and swayed, a wooden cage rattling over a merciless landscape of rock and sagebrush. Now, as it ground to a halt in the center of Dry Creek, the silence that followed was louder than all the noise that had come before. Clara waited. The driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and hardship, hauled a few leather sacks from the roof and grunted. "This is it, miss." He did not look at her as he untied her small, battered trunk from the back. He set it in the dirt with a thud that seemed to echo down the single, wide street. Then he climbed back onto his perch, cracked the whip, and the coach rumbled away, leaving her in a cloud of its departure. She stood alone, a solitary figure in a dress that had seen too much hope and too much despair. It was meant to be a wedding gown, made of simple ivory muslin, but the hem was frayed and stained with the grime of the journey. The delicate lace at the collar was torn, a casualty of a snagged nail on the coach door 100 miles back. This was its third planned wearing. The first had been for a boy who died of a fever before the papers were signed. The second was for a man who took one look at her father's meager offering and rode off without a word. Now, there was this Dry Creek, and a man she had never met. The town seemed to hold its breath. From the dark mouth of the saloon, a few faces peered out. A woman sweeping the porch of the general store paused, her broom still. Even the blacksmith's hammer fell silent. Their stares were not welcoming. They were hard, assessing, the way a man might look at a horse he was considering buying, checking for flaws. Clara felt a familiar chill, the cold dread of being weighed and measured and found wanting. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the afternoon sun was a weight on her head. There was no one to greet her, no groom, no one sent on his behalf. Her instructions, written in a clipped, impersonal hand on a piece of foolscap, had been simple. Arrive on the Tuesday coach and go to the sheriff's office. With her trunk in one hand, she began the walk. The wooden planks of the sidewalk groaned under her worn-out shoes. Each step felt a mile long, each pair of eyes a physical blow. She kept her gaze fixed on the small, square building at the end of the street with the word "Sheriff" painted in faded letters above the door. It was a destination, a point to focus on, a way to keep from turning and running back into the empty expanse of the plains. The sheriff was a man well past his prime, with a kind weariness in his eyes and a mustache stained yellow with tobacco. He stood when she entered, taking off his hat. "You must be Miss Thompson," he said. His voice was gentle, a stark contrast to the harshness outside.
"I am,"
she answered, her own voice a dry whisper.
"I was told. I was to meet Mr. Mallory here."
The sheriff nodded, gesturing to a simple wooden bench. "Have a seat, Luke. He'll be along. He ain't one for timetables." He said it like an apology. Clara sat on the edge of the bench, her back ramrod straight. Her hands clasped so tightly in her lap, her knuckles were white. The office smelled of stale cigar smoke, leather, and something metallic, like old blood. An hour passed. The shadows in the room grew long. The sheriff busied himself with paperwork, the scratch of his pen the only sound. Clara watched a fly buzz against the dirty window pane, a creature as trapped as she felt. Just as the sun began to dip below the rooftops, the door swung open, and the room was filled with a presence that seemed to suck the air from her lungs. He was taller than she had imagined, with shoulders that strained the seams of his dusty canvas coat. His face was all sharp angles and sun-cured leather, carved by wind and work. A dark stubble shadowed a jaw set in a permanent line of grim endurance. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of a winter sky, pale and cold and distant, and they settled on her for a moment with an expression she could not read. It was not anger, not disappointment. It was a flat, unyielding acceptance of an unwelcome task. This was Luke Mallory, her groom. He did not speak to her. He addressed the sheriff. "Is this all of it?" "This is her, Luke," the sheriff said quietly. "Name's Clara." Luke Mallory gave a curt nod, his gaze flicking back to her, then away, as if looking at her for too long was a chore. "Preacher's waiting." He turned and walked out. He had been in the room for less than a minute. Clara felt a fresh wave of humiliation wash over her. She was not a person to him. She was all of it. A piece of business to be concluded. The sheriff sighed, a soft, pitying sound. He ain't a bad man. Miss just closed off. He's seen his share of trouble. Clara stood, her legs trembling. She did not want pity. She had been swimming in it for years, and it was a bitter, useless tonic. She followed the sheriff out into the twilight, her trunk left behind in the office. Luke Mallory was already halfway down the street, his long strides eating up the ground. He did not look back to see if she was following. The chapel stood at the edge of town, leaning as if tired of its own existence. The paint was peeling in long, curling strips, and weeds grew thick around the foundation. The preacher was a young man with a nervous twitch in his eye, holding a worn Bible in his hands. There were no guests, no flowers, just the five of them: Clara, Luke, the sheriff, and the preacher, standing under the vast, indifferent sky as the last light bled from the horizon. The ceremony was an act of brutal efficiency. The preacher rushed through the words, his voice thin against the rising wind. When it came time for the ring, Luke reached into his pocket and pulled out a plain gold band. It was worn smooth with age, as if it had belonged to someone else for a long, long time. "Your hand," he said. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of any warmth. Clara raised her left hand. It was shaking so badly she was afraid she would drop the ring. He took her fingers, his own calloused and rough. His touch was brief, impersonal, the bare minimum of contact required to slide the ring onto her finger. It felt heavy and cold. He did not hold her hand a moment longer than necessary. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher finished, closing his Bible with a snap. And that was it. She was Clara Mallory, a wife in the eyes of God and the law. She belonged to the silent, stone-faced man who stood beside her yet seemed 1,000 miles away. The sheriff shook Luke's hand and gave Clara a solemn nod before turning back toward town. The preacher mumbled his congratulations and scurried back inside the decaying chapel. They were alone. "The saloon keeper's got a room for us," Luke said, already walking away. "For tonight." Again, she followed his retreating back, a stranger trailing her own husband. The saloon was now alive with noise, the tinny sound of a piano and loud, rough laughter spilling out into the street. Luke led her up an external staircase that clung to the side of the building. The room was small and sparse, containing little more than a bed with a lumpy mattress, a wash basin, and a single chair. A film of dust covered everything. He placed the room key on the small nightstand. He did not light the lamp. "I have business to see to," he said, his silhouette dark against the fading light in the doorway. He did not look at her. "Business?" she repeated, the word sounding foolish on her tongue. He finally turned his head, and in the gloom she saw the hard set of his jaw. "That's what I said." Then he was gone, closing the door behind him. His footsteps descended the stairs, and a moment later, she heard the saloon door swing open and shut. Clara stood in the center of the dark room, the sounds from the floor below a cruel mockery of a wedding celebration. Humiliation burned in her chest, a hot, suffocating thing. She was a bride, abandoned on her wedding night before it had even begun. She walked over to the window and looked down at the street. She could not see him. He had disappeared into the night, away from her. Slowly, her fingers went to the back of her dress, fumbling with the tiny buttons. Her hands were still trembling. The simple task felt impossible. She managed to undo a few, the fabric gaping open, but her fingers were clumsy with exhaustion and despair. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. Another man's hands on her, not clumsy but greedy, tearing at the buttons of her dress in a shadowed corner of her father's barn. It had been Mr. Abernathy, the man who had held the note on their land, the second man she was supposed to marry. He had a wet mouth and small, cruel eyes. He'd whispered that a wife ought to get used to a man's touch, that she ought to be grateful. She had fought him, a frantic, silent struggle, until her father's voice had called out from the house, and the man had let her go with a curse, leaving her shaking and soiled with fear. Her father had seen her torn dress, her wild eyes. He had said nothing. A week later, he had taken Abernathy's money for her passage west instead. He had looked at her with his cold, indifferent eyes, the same look he'd given her the day her mother was buried. "You're a practical girl, Clara," he'd said, as if selling her off like a head of cattle was a simple matter of good sense. "You'll do what's necessary." She had always done what was necessary. She had endured the beatings that were meant for her younger brother. She had learned to patch and mend and make a meal from almost nothing. She had held her tongue and bowed her head. She had done everything that was asked of her. What had she done wrong this time? She gave up on the buttons, the dress hanging half open down her back. The chill of the room crept onto her skin. She curled up on the edge of the lumpy bed, pulling her knees to her chest, a small, tight ball of misery. The ivory muslin of her gown wrinkled beneath her. She did not cry. The tears were a frozen lump in her throat, too heavy to fall. She just lay there, listening to the raucous life downstairs, feeling the cold weight of the ring on her finger, and wondering what kind of life awaited her with a man who would not even stay with her until morning. The hours crawled by. The noise from the saloon eventually faded to a drunken murmur, then to silence. The moon cast a pale, lonely square of light on the dusty floor. Sleep would not come. Every creak of the building, every distant bark of a dog, made her heart leap with a desperate, foolish hope that he was returning. He did not. Dawn was breaking when she finally heard the footsteps on the stairs, slow and heavy. The door opened. Luke Mallory stood there, smelling of cold air and whiskey. His face was grim, his eyes shadowed with a weariness that went deeper than a single sleepless night. He looked at her, curled on the bed in her rumpled wedding dress, and for a fleeting instant, something shifted in his expression. It might have been pity. It might have been regret. Then it was gone, replaced by the same shuttered emptiness as before. He did not come to the bed. He unrolled a blanket he carried under his arm and lay down on the floor near the door, turning his back to her without a word. Clara closed her eyes, and this time, a single, hot tear escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Later that morning, when she finally gathered the courage to leave the room, the whispers followed her down the street. She saw the women from the general store, heads together, their hands covering their mouths. Their eyes darted toward her, then away. A pair of cowboys leaving the saloon stopped talking as she passed, their grins knowing and cruel. She did not need to hear the words to know what they were saying. The whole town had seen him leave her alone. They had all seen him return at dawn. The gossip was already spreading like a prairie fire, carried on the wind. He married her, but he won't even touch her. The ride to his cabin was made in a silence as vast and unyielding as the landscape around them. Luke had procured a small, sway-backed mare for her from the livery, and he rode his own powerful gelding a few paces ahead, his back a rigid wall of denial. They left the last vestiges of Dry Creek behind, and the world opened up into a panorama of muted, sun-scorched colors. The Badlands rolled out before them, a place of stark and brutal beauty, where the earth was cracked and dry and the rock formations rose like the bony fingers of a buried giant. Clara had never felt so small, so utterly adrift. This was her new home. this empty, windswept country. The man leading her into it was her husband, yet he felt more like a jailer. After an hour, he finally pointed toward a spot on the horizon that was barely a smudge against the pale sky. "That's it," he said, his voice rough from disuse. As they drew closer, her heart sank. The structure that emerged from the landscape was less a cabin and more the skeleton of one. It was built of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud that had crumbled away in many places, leaving dark gaps that stared like empty eyes. The roof sagged in the middle, and the whole building seemed to be leaning into the constant, sighing wind. Beside it stood a small, dilapidated barn. In slightly better repair, there was no garden, no sign of life, save for a thin curl of smoke rising from a stone chimney. Luke dismounted and tied the horses to a weathered hitching post. He did not help her down. Clara slid from the mare's back, her legs stiff, her muslin dress catching on the dry brush. He gestured with his chin toward the cabin. "The main room is yours. Bed's in there. I'll be in the loft." He meant the barn. He was putting a building between them. The finality in his tone left no room for questions. He unstrapped her small trunk from the mare, set it on the ground by the cabin door, and then led the horses toward the barn without another look in her direction. Clara pushed open the heavy wooden door. It scraped against the floorboards. The inside was one large room, cleaner than she expected, but just as stark. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A narrow bed with a thin mattress and a patched quilt was pushed against the other. There was a rough planked table, 2 chairs, and a few iron pots hanging by the hearth. That was all. It was the home of a man who did not live so much as he existed. The days that followed fell into a pattern of silent, punishing labor. Luke rose before the sun. The sounds of his movements in the barn, the splash of water, the clink of a buckle, serving as her alarm clock. He would be gone by the time she worked up the nerve to step outside, off to mend fences or work with his small herd of cattle that grazed somewhere out in the desolate hills. He worked with a relentless, punishing rhythm as if trying to exhaust a demon that lived inside him. Clara, in turn, tried to carve out a space for herself in the suffocating silence. She swept the floor, but the fine dust of the Badlands crept back in through the chinking as soon as she was done. She found a pile of torn saddlebags and a leather worker's kit in a dusty corner of the barn and set about mending them. Her small, neat stitches, a quiet rebellion against the decay around her. She cooked over the open flame in the fireplace, simple meals of beans and salt pork, which she would leave on the table for him. She found a small, neglected patch of earth behind the cabin where the soil seemed slightly less hostile. With a broken spade she'd found, she began to turn the earth, her hands blistering, her back aching. She was determined to make something grow. She had a small cloth pouch of seeds in her trunk, marigold, chamomile, a few hardy beans, a pathetic inheritance from her mother's garden. She would plant them. She would bring color to this colorless place. Luke kept his distance. He would return at dusk, covered in the grime of his work, take the plate of food she left for him, and eat standing by the fire, his back to her. The first few times, she tried to speak. "I mended your saddlebags," she said one evening, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He grunted in acknowledgement, his eyes on the fire.
"Another time,"
she ventured.
"The ground is hard, but I think something might grow."
He said nothing at all. After that, she stopped trying. They lived in the same small space, 2 ghosts orbiting each other, their presence marked only by the plates of food and the newly mended leather. He never entered the main room of the cabin while she was awake, save to get his meal, and by the time the sun rose, his bedroll in the barn loft was empty. 2 weeks into this hollow marriage, the sky turned a bruised, angry purple. The wind, usually a constant whisper, began to howl, rattling the wooden shutters and shrieking through the gaps in the logs. Clara had seen prairie storms before, but this one felt different. It felt personal. a wild and violent thing bent on tearing their fragile world apart. She sat on the edge of her bed, watching the flashes of lightning that lit the room in stark, terrifying detail. Rain began to fall, first as tentative drops, then as a torrential downpour, drumming against the roof like 1,000 angry fists. A leak started in the corner, a steady drip, drip, drip into a puddle on the floor. Then another. Suddenly, with a deafening groan, a sound of splintering wood came from directly above her. A section of the roof, the part that sagged the most, had given way. Rain and wind tore into the room. Clara scrambled back, a cry catching in her throat as she stared at the new, jagged hole that opened up to the raging, black sky. Panic seized her. She was alone, miles from anywhere, in a crumbling cabin that was being torn apart by the storm. She wrapped her arms around herself, trembling, her thin cotton nightgown quickly becoming soaked from the spray. The main door burst open, slamming against the interior wall with a crack like a gunshot. Luke stood there, silhouetted by the lightning, rain streaming from the brim of his hat. He took in the scene in an instant, the hole in the roof, the water pouring in, and her, cowering and soaked by the bed. He moved past her without a word, his focus entirely on the damage. He grabbed a length of rope from a peg on the wall and dragged one of the heavy chairs under the gaping hole. With a strength that seemed almost inhuman, he hauled himself up into the rafters. For the next hour, he fought the storm. Clara could only watch, a helpless spectator, as he wrestled with the loose timbers, securing them with the rope, his muscles straining against the force of the wind. Finally, he dropped back to the floor, breathing heavily, his shirt plastered to his chest. The immediate danger had passed. The roof was secured, and though water still dripped through, the deluge had been stopped. He turned, and his eyes found her. The room was dark, but a flash of lightning illuminated her, freezing the moment in time. She was shivering, her nightgown clinging to her body, her hair plastered to her face. She saw something flicker in his eyes then, something that was not indifference. It was a raw, unguarded heat, a spark of awareness that made the air between them crackle. He saw her not as a duty, not as a burden, but as a woman. The moment stretched, taut and fragile. He took a half step toward her, his hand slightly raised. Then he seemed to catch himself. The shutter came down over his eyes again, the brief warmth extinguished. He turned away, shrugging out of his heavy canvas coat. "Here," he said, his voice gruff. He tossed it to her. It landed on the bed, smelling of rain, horses, and him. "Get warm." He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. He did not look back. "I'll fix it proper in the morning." Then he was gone, back into the storm and the solitude of his barn. Clara pulled on the coat. It was huge on her, the sleeves covering her hands, the hem reaching her knees. But it was warm, and it held the faint, masculine scent of him. She curled up on the dry part of the bed, wrapped in his coat, and for the first time in a long time, she did not feel entirely alone. He had come for her. He had protected her. He left before dawn again. But something had shifted. The next evening, instead of eating by the fire with his back to her, Luke sat down at the table. He did not speak, but he sat. They ate their meal in the usual silence. But it was a different kind of silence. It was a shared silence, not an imposed one. A few nights later, as she was clearing the plates, Clara spoke into the quiet. "I used to dream of being a schoolteacher," she said, her voice soft. She did not know why she said it. The words just came out, a small, fragile truth offered up into the space between them. She expected him to ignore her. Instead, after a long moment, he answered, "It's a hard life for a teacher out here." "I know," she said, her heart beating a little faster. "But I love books. I love the idea of opening up the world for a child." He looked at his hands, his calloused,
scarred hands that were so different from hers. There ain't much world to open up in Dry Creek.
The conversation was stilted, hesitant, but it was a start. A few days later, it was his turn. They were sitting at the table again, the fire casting flickering shadows on the log walls.
I was supposed to be married once,
he said suddenly, his voice low and rough. He stared into the flames as if the memory were playing out there. Her name was Eleanor. She was gentle, like you. Clara held her breath, not daring to move. She took sick, he continued, his voice hardening. Scarlet fever. I brought her into town, to the clinic, but her family was from the settlement down the river, and folks in Dry Creek were scared. They said she might spread the sickness. The doctor, he turned us away, sent us back out here, his hands clenched into fists on the table. She died 2 days later, right there, in that bed. Clara looked at the narrow bed against the wall, and a chill went through her that had nothing to do with the night air. She finally understood. It was not just her that he was keeping at a distance. He was keeping the ghost of his own heart at bay. She understood his silence, his isolation, his deep-seated mistrust of the town and the people in it. Their fragile peace was shattered the following week by the arrival of the preacher from town, the same nervous young man who had married them. He rode up on a sway-backed mule, his Bible clutched in his hand like a shield. Mr. Mallory, he said, nodding curtly to Luke, who was splitting logs by the barn. He then turned his disapproving gaze on Clara, who stood in the doorway of the cabin.
And Mrs.
Mallory, he said the name with a faint, scornful emphasis. I've come to collect the Lord's tithe and to inquire about your spiritual welfare. Luke stopped his work, leaning the axe against the chopping block.
We ain't got anything for you.
The preacher's face tightened. Every soul must contribute, Mr. Mallory, but that is not my primary concern. The town is talking. They speak of this arrangement. He gestured from the cabin to the barn. It is an unseemly thing. A man and a woman living in such a way. It invites temptation and judgment. People are saying you live here with a man who won't even claim you as his own. The words were a physical slap. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The town's whispers had found their way here, to her doorstep, delivered by a man of God. Luke took a slow, deliberate step forward. His voice was dangerously quiet. What people say in town ain't your concern, and it ain't mine. You should get back on your mule and ride out of here before you say something you'll regret. The preacher, seeing the cold fury in Luke's eyes, stammered for a moment before turning and scrambling back onto his mule, riding off in a cloud of righteous indignation. The silence he left behind was heavy and sharp. Clara could not bear it. She could not bear the shame. Tears she had held back for weeks finally came, hot and furious. She turned on Luke, her voice choked with anguish.
Is that what I am to you? An arrangement? A duty you regret? She cried, the words tumbling out of her. Did you ever mean for this to be a real marriage? Or was I just some package to be delivered and hidden away?
Luke's face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were filled with a torment that mirrored her own. He took a step toward her, then stopped, as if there were an invisible wall between them he could not cross.
I promised my brother, he said, his voice raw. He knew your father, knew you were in trouble. He made me swear I'd look after you.
He shook his head, a gesture of bitter frustration.
I didn't expect this. I didn't expect to want anything more than what was promised, but I can't give you what I don't have. Clara, I can't promise you tomorrow.
His admission hung in the air between them. He didn't expect to want anything more. It was a confession, wrapped in a denial. It was everything and it was nothing. She turned and fled into the cabin, slamming the door behind her. She threw herself onto the bed, Eleanor's deathbed, and sobbed until she had no tears left, her body aching with a grief too deep for a single cause. Night fell. She heard him come in, as he always did, to get his plate of food. She did not move. She lay facing the wall, her body tense. She heard him sit at the table. The silence was absolute. After a long time, she heard the chair scrape as he stood up. She expected him to leave, to return to the safety of his loft. But his footsteps stopped in the middle of the room. He did not leave. He was just standing there, in the darkness, waiting. Clara turned over slowly, her heart pounding. She could just make out his shape in the gloom, a tall, solitary figure. Her voice was a bare whisper, a fragile plea sent across the chasm that separated them. "Stay until morning," she whispered, the words trembling in the air. "Even if you don't want me tomorrow." She saw his shoulders tense. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, a man caught between the ghosts of his past and the terrifying possibility of a future. Then, slowly, he walked not to the door, but to the fireplace. He unrolled his blanket and lay down on the hard-packed earth of the hearth. He stayed. He stayed. He slept on the floor by the hearth, a silent guardian in the darkness. And when the first gray light of dawn filtered into the cabin, he was still there. The simple fact of his presence was a seismic shift, a crack in the foundation of their silent arrangement. He no longer retreated to the barn before she woke. He would already be tending the fire when she opened her eyes, the scent of wood smoke a quiet promise that she was not alone. The walls between them, once so solid, began to feel thin and porous after their silent dinners. Luke started lingering. He would not go straight to the barn, but would find some small task to occupy his hands within the cabin's four walls. He would sit by the fire, mending a piece of tack, the rhythmic pull of his needle a steady, comforting sound in the quiet. He never looked directly at her for long, but she could feel his awareness of her, a subtle weight in the air. Clara, in turn, began to offer up her own quiet invitations. She took to brushing her hair not in the privacy of the cabin, but sitting on the porch step as the sun went down. She would unpin the heavy auburn mass and draw her mother's silver-backed brush through it in long, slow strokes, letting it catch the golden evening light. She knew he watched her from the shadows of the barn. She could feel his gaze on the line of her neck, on the movement of her hands, and a strange, fluttering warmth would bloom in her chest, a feeling so foreign and so hopeful it almost frightened her. Their new, fragile world was built not on words, but on these small, unspoken rituals. It was a language of proximity, of shared silence that had become comfortable instead of strained. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the cabin's heat, Clara followed the thin ribbon of a creek that cut through Luke's property. It was a greener, gentler place, where cottonwoods grew and the air was cooler. As she walked along the bank, she saw it, a small brown bird, a sparrow, caught in the cruel jaws of a wire snare. Its struggle was long over. Its neck was broken, its tiny body limp and pathetic. A wave of profound sadness washed over her. It was not just for the bird. It was for the senseless cruelty of it, for the trap set for some other creature that had ended this small, innocent life. It was for every beautiful thing broken by a world that did not care. She knelt in the soft mud, tears blurring her vision as she gently tried to work the bird free from the wire. "Leave it." Luke's voice, low and close behind her, made her jump. She had not heard him approach. He stood over her, his shadow falling across the dead bird. "It's cruel," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Whatever it was for, this little thing didn't deserve it." He knelt beside her, his movements surprisingly graceful for such a large man. He looked from her tear-streaked face to the bird in the trap. His own expression was hard to read, but the usual harshness in his eyes had softened to something that looked like sorrow. With his large, calloused hands, he deftly undid the snare and lifted the bird out. It lay still and perfect in his palm. "Nothing does," he said quietly. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the distance that had always separated them seemed to vanish. He saw the genuine grief in her eyes, the trembling of her lip. He lifted a hand, his fingers rough against her cheek.
and wiped away a tear with his thumb. The touch was hesitant, gentle, a question.
Clara leaned into his hand. A silent answer. Her own hand came up to rest on his wrist. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the sound of the creak and the heat of his skin against hers. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not. His lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of shared sorrow and profound loneliness. It was tender and sad. A soft, hesitant press that spoke of all the pain they both held inside. But then, something shifted. A spark ignited deep within the sadness. A current of long-suppressed need that was both startling and undeniable. The kiss deepened, becoming something more. A desperate, electric acknowledgement of the man and woman they were. Here and now. Alive and breathing in a world full of traps. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. He did not let her go, his hand still cupping her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. For the first time, she saw not the ghost of Eleanor in his eyes, but a reflection of herself. Their growing closeness, however, was a world of their own, and the world outside was not so kind. A trip into Dry Creek for supplies a week later was a harsh reminder. At the general store, the proprietor, Mr. Henderson, looked down his nose at her list. "That will be cash," he said loudly so the other customers could hear. "No credit for the Mallory place."
"Luke has always had credit here,"
Clara said, her cheeks burning. "Luke Mallory has a new situation," Henderson replied, his eyes flicking over her with disdain. "And I run a respectable business. Cash only." Humiliated, she paid with the few coins Luke had given her, leaving half the supplies behind. Outside, a woman named Martha Gable, whose piety was the sharpest weapon in town, was sweeping the boardwalk. As Clara passed, the woman turned and spat into the dust. A mere inch from the hem of Clara's dress. The message was clear. Clara hurried toward the livery to meet Luke, her heart pounding with a familiar, sickening shame. As they were preparing to leave, one of the saloon loungers, a man named Jed, swaggered over. "Well now, Mallory," Jed drawled, a smirk on his face. "Finally decided to take your damaged goods out for some air?" Before Clara could even process the insult, Luke moved. He was not fast, but deliberate, a force of nature. He had Jed by the front of his shirt, lifting him half off his feet and slamming him against the livery wall. The smirk vanished from Jed's face, replaced by pure terror. "The next time you open your mouth to speak about my wife," Luke said, his voice a low, terrifying growl, "it will be the last time you have teeth to do it with. Do you understand me?" Jed nodded frantically, his eyes wide. Luke held him there a moment longer, then dropped him in a heap in the dirt. He turned, took Clara's arm, and helped her onto the mare without another word. The ride home was silent, but this time it was a silence charged with his fury, a fury that had been unleashed on her behalf. He had called her his wife. He had defended her. The threats were not just social. A few days later, a man in a buggy rode out to the cabin. He was well-dressed, with a politician's smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. He introduced himself as Judge Miller. "Mr. Mallory," the judge began, gesturing to the vast, empty land around them. "Progress is coming. The railroad is pushing west, and they mean to lay track right through this valley. It will bring prosperity. Jobs. They've authorized me to make generous offers to the landowners." He named a figure that was insultingly low. Luke stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "The land's not for sale." The judge's smile tightened. "Perhaps you misunderstand. This is a matter of public good. A man who stands in the way of progress often finds himself left behind, or pushed aside. I would reconsider, if I were you." "I've considered," Luke said, his voice flat and final. "The answer is no."
Judge Miller's eyes narrowed. He looked from Luke's unmoving form to Clara, standing in the doorway. A man with a wife to think of should be more practical. He tipped his hat and left, the threat hanging in the air. That night, a feeling of dread settled over Clara. She felt like a curse, bringing the town's scorn and now this new danger down upon him. Her own insecurities, never far from the surface, began to churn. While mending one of Luke's old shirts, a loose thread in the lining of his trunk caught her eye. Tugging it, she found a false bottom, and inside, nestled in a piece of velvet, was a small, oval portrait. The woman in the photograph was beautiful. She had fair hair, a wide, confident smile, and eyes that shone with life and happiness. Eleanor. Clara's heart twisted with a jealousy so sharp and cold it stole her breath. This was the woman he had loved, the woman who had died in this very cabin. She was perfect, untouched by scandal or shame, her memory enshrined and pure. How could Clara, with her tattered past and the town's judgment clinging to her like dust, ever compete with a saint? She was a replacement, a duty, the kiss by the creek. His defense of her in town, it was all just pity. He was a good man, trapped by a promise to his brother, and she was his burden. The thought became a certainty, a painful truth she could no longer ignore. She had to set him free. She waited until the cabin was deep in slumber, the only sound the chirping of crickets and Luke's steady breathing from his bedroll by the fire. With trembling hands, she lit a single candle and wrote a short, simple note on a piece of wrapping paper. I am releasing you from your promise. You deserve a life free of this burden. I will not bring any more trouble to your door. Forgive me. C. She folded it and placed it on the rough wooden table where he would see it. She took off her worn shoes, leaving them by the door. She would not take anything that was not hers. Barefoot, in nothing but her thin cotton shift, she pulled the door open and stepped out into the cold, dark night. The wild, empty land stretched out before her, an intimidating and unknown future, but it was better than staying where she was not truly wanted. She had taken no more than 3 steps when the cabin door creaked open behind her. He stood there, a tall, dark shape against the faint firelight from within. He did not speak. His eyes went from her, standing barefoot and trembling in the dirt, to the folded note on the table. He understood instantly. She expected him to yell, to be angry at her foolishness. She expected him to let her go, to accept his freedom with relief. He did neither. He walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His face was in shadow, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. He reached out, not to grab her arm or to stop her, but his rough, calloused fingers went to the simple ribbon that tied the front of her nightgown. Slowly, with an agonizing tenderness, he pulled the bow undone. The simple act was more powerful than any words he could have spoken. It was not a command, but a claiming. It was an answer to the letter she had written, an erasure of every doubt she had. He drew the edges of her gown apart slightly, his knuckles brushing her skin, and then, taking her hand, he drew her back over the threshold, back into the warmth and safety of the cabin. He led her to the bed, the one that had once been Eleanor's, the one she had slept in alone for so long. He drew back the quilt. The air was thick with trembling fear and a desperate, aching longing that had been denied for too long. This was not the gentle, sorrowful man from the creek side. This was a man staking his claim, refusing to let her go. As he lowered her onto the mattress, she looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the desire warring with a lifetime of restraint, a fear of hurting her. "Luke," she whispered, her voice shaking. Don't be gentle with me because you feel you have to, not out of pity." She reached up, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him down to her. "I want to feel something real." It was a plea to be seen not as damaged, not as a duty,
but as a woman who was wanted. It was permission. It was a dare. A soft surrender passed between them, and the last of his control broke. The night was filled with the desperate, healing collision of two broken people. Every touch a reclamation, every kiss a promise whispered against the skin. In his arms, Clara was not a burden or a bride of convenience. She was real, and she was wanted. The next morning, she woke to the unfamiliar weight of an arm thrown over her waist. The sun was streaming through the gaps in the logs. For a panicked moment, she thought he would be gone, that the night had been a dream, and he would be back in the barn, the walls rebuilt between them. But he was there, lying beside her, his dark hair messy on the pillow, his face soft in sleep. He was still there. The next morning, he did not leave. The world did not change overnight, but Clara's place in it did. When they rode into Dry Creek now, she was not a half step behind him like a shadow, but beside him, the sway of her mare matching the steady gait of his gelding. He did not walk ahead of her on the town's dusty boardwalk. He walked with her, his presence a silent, unyielding statement. The townsfolk still stared. Their whispers still followed her like burrs on a blanket, but their scorn was now mixed with a grudging curiosity. Luke Mallory, the man who was a law unto himself, had claimed his wife. Clara, emboldened by the solid warmth of Luke's presence beside her, began to carve out a small corner of the world for herself. She had found an old primer in her trunk, its pages soft with use, filled with the simple stories and letters her mother had once read to her. She began to notice the children of the town, the ones who ran barefoot and dirty, whose parents were too poor or too drunk to see to their learning. She started simply, sitting on a bench outside the general store while Luke was inside. A young girl, maybe 7, with eyes too old for her face, watched her from a distance. Clara opened the book and began to read aloud, her voice soft but clear. The next time they came to town, the girl was there again, and this time her younger brother was with her. Soon, a small, ragged circle of children would gather whenever she appeared, drawn to the magic of the words, to the patient way she would trace the letters with her finger and help them sound out their names. It was not a schoolhouse, but it was a beginning. It was her dream, taking root in the town's most barren soil. But goodwill is a fragile crop in a place like Dry Creek. The rumors did not die, they simply changed their shape. The whispers were no longer about a man who would not touch his wife, but about the nature of the woman he had finally taken to his bed. One afternoon, in the dry goods store, Clara saw a bolt of soft, yellow flannel. On impulse, she touched it. It was warm and gentle against her skin. A thought, quiet and hopeful as a prayer, flickered through her mind. The fabric would be perfect for a crib lining or a baby's blanket. She was not with child, but the idea of it, once a terrifying prospect, now felt like a distant, shining possibility. She thought perhaps of the blacksmith's wife, who was expecting, and what a kind gift it might make. She bought a yard of it, along with her flour and salt. Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, watched the transaction with narrowed eyes. By the time Clara and Luke were saddling their horses to leave, the story was already spreading, twisted and ugly. "The Mallory woman," the whispers said. "The one he wouldn't have, is trying to trap him now." Buying baby things, bold as brass, shameless. The town, which had scorned her for being an untouched wife, now seemed poised to scorn her for being a wife in truth. The moral frenzy was a fever, and she was its cause. The true storm broke on a hot, still afternoon a week later. Luke was away, having taken a small part of his herd to a better grazing pasture a day's ride south. A rider approached the cabin, not with the hurried gait of a man with business, but with the slow, deliberate pace of a cat approaching a bird. The rider was a woman. She was dressed in a traveling dress of deep scarlet that seemed to mock the dun-colored landscape. As she dismounted, Clara saw that she was striking, with hair the color of midnight piled high on her head and a mouth painted a defiant red. She moved with a fluid, confident grace that spoke of saloon stages and the appreciative eyes of men.
"You must be the new Mrs. Mallory," the woman said. Her voice was husky, laced with a world-weary amusement. She did not wait for an invitation but walked right up onto the porch. "I'm Sadie, an old friend of Luke's." Clara's hand instinctively went to the collar of her simple calico dress. She felt plain, drab, a pale sketch next to this vibrant, finished painting. "He's not here." "I know," Sadie said, her eyes sweeping over Clara, taking in every detail with an unnerving intensity. "It's you I came to see." She smiled, a flash of white teeth. It was not a friendly smile. "I was singing at the saloon in Dusty Gulch when I heard the news. Luke Mallory. Married, I must say. I never thought I'd see the day, especially not to... Well, the story was quite something." Clara stood her ground in the doorway. "I don't know what business it is of yours," Sadie laughed, a low, throaty sound. "Oh, it's no business of mine now. Honey, but Luke and we go back, way back, and I know him. He's a man who pays his debts, and he has been paying for you for a very, very long time." A cold knot of dread formed in Clara's stomach. "I don't understand." "Don't you?" Sadie leaned against a porch post, studying her painted nails. "Years ago, maybe 3 or 4, Luke came through the town I was in. He'd just sold a prize stallion, had more money than he knew what to do with. He heard a story from a drifter, a story about a farmer back east, a man with a pretty daughter he was looking to trade to the highest bidder to settle a debt. A girl named Clara." Clara felt the world tilt. She gripped the doorframe to steady herself. "Luke never met you," Sadie continued, her voice soft and cruel. "But the story, it got under his skin. He paid a man a hefty sum, said to use it to settle your father's debt, to make sure you weren't sold off to some brute. He wanted you to be safe. He made the man promise never to say where the money came from." Sadie finally looked up, her dark eyes pinning Clara in place. "He bought your freedom long before he ever laid eyes on you. This marriage, this promise to his brother, it was just the final payment on a debt he thought he'd already settled. You weren't a bride. Honey, you were a charity case." The word struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. Every moment of the past months replayed in her mind, now tainted and twisted by this new, horrible truth. His reluctance, his distance, his shame-faced duty, it wasn't about Eleanor. It was about her. She was a project, a good deed he felt obligated to see through to the end. The kiss, their night together, his defense of her in town. Was it all just pity? Was he just trying to be kind to the poor, damaged creature he had bought and paid for? The betrayal was so profound, so complete, it left no room for tears. A cold, hard anger rose in their place. "Get out," she said, her voice a dead, level thing she did not recognize as her own. Sadie's smile wavered. This was not the reaction she had expected. She shrugged. "Just thought you should know the kind of man you married." She turned and sauntered back to her horse. Mounting with practiced ease, she rode away without looking back. When Luke's silhouette appeared on the horizon the next evening, Clara was waiting. As soon as he dismounted, before he could even speak, she stood in the doorway and said, "You can sleep in the barn." The confusion, then the hurt, in his eyes was plain to see. "Clara, what is it?" "A woman named Sadie came to visit," she said, her voice shaking with contained fury. "She told me everything, about the money, about my father, all this time you've been looking at me. You've just been seeing some poor soul you needed to rescue. I was never your wife. I was your burden." "Clara, it wasn't like that." "Wasn't it?" she shot back. "You lied to me every single day. You lied to me with your silence." She stepped back inside and slammed the heavy door in his face. Sliding the thick wooden bolt into place, she leaned against it,
her body trembling, and listened as he stood outside for a long time before his heavy footsteps finally retreated toward the barn. The next day passed in a haze of misery. She did not leave the cabin. He did not approach. They were back where they started. Only now the wall between them was built of his deception and her pain. Late the following afternoon, another rider appeared. It was not Luke. It was a man she recognized as one of Judge Miller's associates, a land agent named Davies. He was not alone. 2 other rough-looking men were with him. Mrs. Mallory, Davies said, dismounting. He held up a piece of paper. This is a writ of eviction. Your husband has refused a generous offer in the name of progress. The railroad has decided not to wait for his permission. You have 1 hour to vacate the premises. Clara's heart pounded. You have no right. This is our land. Not anymore, Davies said with a smirk. Now, are you going to leave peacefully? No, she said, her anger from the day before finding a new target. I am not. Davies's face hardened. Then we'll do it for you. He gestured to his men, who started walking toward the cabin. Clara stood her ground, her body blocking the door. You will not enter this house. One of the men grabbed her arm. She twisted away, but the other one caught her from behind. She struggled, kicking and scratching, a wild thing fighting for her home. Davies watched with cold amusement. In the scuffle, she was pushed backward, losing her footing on the top step of the porch. She tumbled down the 3 wooden stairs, landing hard in the dirt. A sharp, sickening crack echoed in the air as her left wrist bent under her at an unnatural angle. A cry of pure agony was torn from her throat. The men froze, their bravado vanishing at the sound of bone breaking. Davies swore under his breath. Get her things. Let's go. They tossed her trunk out into the dirt beside her and rode off, leaving her in a heap of pain and humiliation as the sun began to set. It was nearly dark when Luke returned. He saw the trunk first, then her, huddled by the steps, cradling her grotesquely swollen wrist. A sound escaped his throat, a primal roar of disbelief and rage. He was off his horse in an instant, kneeling beside her, his face a mask of horror. Clara, my God, who did this? Davies, she gasped, the pain a white-hot fire shooting up her arm. The judge's man, they tried to evict me. Luke's face went pale. Then a dark, dangerous red crept up his neck, the control he so carefully maintained. The wall of silence he built around himself shattered into a million pieces. He helped her gently into the house, his hands surprisingly tender as he fashioned a makeshift splint. And then he turned, his eyes burning with a light she had never seen before. Stay here, he said, his voice deadly calm. Bolt the door. He walked out, mounted his horse, and rode toward Dry Creek not at a canter, but at a full, desperate gallop. He found Davies in the saloon, celebrating his victory. Luke did not speak. He walked straight up to the man, pulled him from his chair, and dragged him out into the street. The town came to a standstill as Luke, in a blind, silent fury, began to beat the man who had hurt his wife. He hit him again and again, long after Davies had fallen to the ground, long after he had stopped fighting back. It was not a fight. It was a punishment, delivered by a man who had lost his soul to rage. It was only when the sheriff and 2 other men physically pulled him off that the beating stopped. Davies lay unconscious and bleeding in the dirt. Clara found him in the town's single jail cell a few hours later, her arm in a proper sling, her face pale with pain and worry. He was sitting on the cot, his head in his hands, his knuckles bloody. He would not look at her. Luke, she said softly through the bars. You shouldn't be here, he mumbled, his voice thick with shame. You should have let them take the land. It's my fault. I left you alone. I couldn't even do the one thing I promised, to keep you safe. That isn't true, she said, her own anger from before forgotten, burned away by the ferocity of his actions. She finally understood. It wasn't pity that had driven him. It was this powerful, terrifying, all-consuming need to protect her. "I'll pay the bail," she said. "No," he said, finally looking up, his eyes filled with self-loathing. "I won't let you. I belong in here." Clara reached through the bars, her good hand resting on his arm. Her voice was quiet, but it rang with an unshakable certainty. "You already paid for me," she said, her eyes holding his. "You paid with your horse, and you paid with your solitude, and today you paid with your heart. I won't let them take you too." He stared at her, the shame in his eyes slowly being replaced by a dawning, incredulous hope. She left the jail and walked directly to the barber. Without a word, she sat in the chair and let him cut off her long, auburn hair, the hair Luke had watched her brush in the evenings. She took the money without flinching. From there, she went to the town's assayer. She pulled the simple gold band from her finger, the ring that had marked the beginning of their hollow marriage, and slid it across the counter. Finally, she sold the last thing she owned of any value, a small, silver locket from her mother. It was enough. She walked back to the sheriff's office, the bail money clutched in her hand, her head held high. Luke was released into the cold, flat light of morning. He walked out of the sheriff's office a free man, but he did not look free. He looked caged by a shame so profound it bent his shoulders. He stopped dead when he saw Clara waiting for him. It was her hair. He stared at the shorn, ragged ends that now barely brushed her collar, and a look of such raw pain crossed his face that it was more wrenching than any of his anger had been. He reached out, his hand hesitating, and his rough fingers gently touched the place where her long auburn braid used to be. "You shouldn't have," he whispered, his voice thick. "There was no other way," she said simply. There was no apology in her tone, only a quiet, unshakable resolve. She had done what was necessary. For him, the ride back to the cabin was a slow, heavy journey. The silence between them was no longer one of distance, but of shared trauma. They were two soldiers returning from a war, too weary to speak of the battle. As they crested the final rise that overlooked their small piece of land, they both saw it at the same time. The cabin door, which Luke had painstakingly built from solid pine, was blackened and charred in the center, as if someone had tried to set it ablaze, and painted across the logs beside it, in sloppy, dripping letters of crude white paint, were the words, "Whore bride, broken cowboy." Luke let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure, helpless rage. He spurred his horse forward, dismounting before the animal had even stopped, and stood before the painted slurs as if they were a physical blow. All the violence, all the fury he had unleashed on Davies had been for nothing. The town's poison had followed them home. He slammed his fist against the log wall, a crack of knuckles against wood that echoed in the still air. Clara slid from her mare, her legs unsteady. She looked at the hateful words, at the burned door, at the man she loved standing broken before their ruined home. She felt the familiar sting of shame, the cold dread she had lived with for so long. She expected to crumble. She expected the tears to come. But they did not. Instead, something else rose up inside her, a hard, defiant anger. They had taken her hair, her ring, her mother's locket. They had taken her reputation and Luke's freedom. They would not take this. They would not take her home. She walked past Luke, into the barn. She found a bucket, a stiff brush, and a block of lye soap. She filled the bucket from the water barrel and walked back to the cabin. She dipped the brush in the water, scraped it against the soap, and began to scrub at the first painted letter. Luke turned, watching her as if in a daze. Her movements were small but fierce. Her good arm, the one not in a sling, worked with a tireless rhythm, scrubbing at the insult. The paint was stubborn, but with each motion, she was not just cleaning the wall. She was refusing to be broken. She was erasing their judgment with her own will. He watched her for a long moment, the fury draining out of him, replaced by a sense of awe. This was not the timid, frightened girl who had arrived in Dry Creek. This was a woman forged in the fires of this harsh, unforgiving land. Without a word, he went and found another rag and a bottle of turpentine. He knelt beside her, and they worked together, side by side, in a shared, determined silence. They worked all day, first on the paint, then on the door. He showed her how to sand away the worst of the char, how to mix sawdust with pine tar to fill the gouges. Their hands touched often, small, accidental brushes that sent jolts of awareness through them both. They did not speak of what had happened in town, or of Sadie, or of the money. They spoke of the grain of the wood, of the angle of the sun. They spoke of the work, and in the simple, honest labor of repair, their connection, which had been forged in shame and fire, was tempered into something stronger than steel. That evening, they sat on the porch steps, exhausted and sore, watching the sky bleed from orange to purple. The words were gone, though a faint, ghostly outline remained, a scar on the skin of their home. Clara turned to him in the fading light. The question had been sitting on her heart all day, a heavy, necessary stone. "Luke," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "do you love me?" He went very still. He stared out at the Badlands, his jaw working as if he were chewing on the words, trying to find their shape. For a long time, he said nothing, and Clara's heart began to ache with the fear that she had pushed too far, that she had asked for the one thing he could not give. Finally, he turned to her. His eyes, in the twilight, were dark and deep and filled with a raw, painful honesty. "Clara," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I don't know about words like that. They don't fit right in my mouth." He took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "But I know this." He looked from her eyes to the repaired door, then back again. "It's not love if I could walk away. And I can't." The words settled into her soul, more true and more real than any flowery poem. He could not walk away. It was not a choice. It was a fact, elemental and unchangeable as the rock of the Badlands. It was enough. It was everything. That night, something shifted between them again. After their simple meal, as the stars began to appear, a brilliant, scattered dust of diamonds in the black sky. He did not unroll his bedroll by the fire. He took her hand and led her outside, back to the porch. He pulled a thick blanket from his saddle and spread it on the rough planked floor. There, under the vast, open sky, with the ghosts of the hateful words beside them, they came together. This time, it was not the desperate, fearful coupling of their first night. This was a deliberate claiming, a defiant act of love in a world that wished them ill. They were the broken cowboy and the whore bride, and they would not hide. They made love on the floor of their porch, a desperate, passionate act of creating their own world, their own rules. Every boundary was crossed. Every scar on his hands and on her heart was kissed. Every silent, painful memory was soothed by a touch that said, "I see you, I know you, and I will not walk away." In the weeks that followed, a fragile peace settled over the cabin. A quiet, hopeful routine took hold, and with it, a new possibility began to dawn on Clara. She had been tired, more so than usual, and her monthly courses, usually so regular, were late. A small, terrifying, wonderful seed of hope began to grow in her heart. She said nothing to Luke. It was too new, too fragile to be spoken aloud. She held the secret close, a tiny, warm ember against the cold fear that it might not be true. One morning, she woke to a familiar cramping low in her belly. She went to the outhouse, her heart pounding with a sick dread. When she saw the blood, a small, choked sob escaped her lips. The ember of hope was extinguished, leaving only cold ash. She walked back to the cabin, her body hollow with a grief she had not even known she was capable of feeling.
Luke was at the table, mending a bridle. He looked up and saw her face. He saw the devastation in her eyes, the single tear that traced a path down her cheek. He did not have to ask. He knew. He stood up, came to her, and wrapped his arms around her. He held her as she began to weep, silent, racking sobs for a future that had been imagined and lost in the space of a few short weeks. He held her tightly, his own eyes wet, his body shaking with the force of their shared, unspoken grief. They wept together in silence, for the baby that would not be, for the cruelty of a land that gave with one hand and took with the another. That afternoon, after their grief had subsided into a quiet, aching sadness, Luke made a decision. He rode into town, but he did not go to the saloon or the livery. He went straight to the office of Judge Miller. The judge looked up, surprised and wary, as Luke entered. "Mallory?" he said. "I trust you are here to accept the railroad's offer. After recent events, it would be the wisest course of action." "I'll sell you the land," Luke said, his voice flat and even. The judge's face relaxed into a smug smile, but it vanished as Luke continued. "But I have one condition. I am not in the habit of negotiating with men like you." "You'll negotiate this," Luke said, his voice hardening. "I'll sign over my deed, but the money from the sale is to be used to purchase the old Miller homestead, the one by the river, and the deed for that new property. It is to be written in one name, and one name only." He leaned forward, his hands flat on the judge's desk, his eyes burning with an intensity that made the other man flinch. "Clara Mallory." Judge Miller stared at him, incredulous. Then he laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You want me to put a deed in the name of that woman? A woman of her reputation, a woman who was sold to you, whose name is a scandal in this town. The law barely recognizes a woman's right to own property at all, let alone one like her. It's impossible, preposterous." "Then the deal is off," Luke said, turning to leave. "You'd give up everything for her?" the judge called after him, his voice a mixture of anger and disbelief. Luke stopped at the door and turned back, his gaze sweeping over the judge with cold contempt. "She already gave up everything for me." He walked out into the main street, where a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the news of his presence in the judge's office. He saw Mr. Henderson from the general store, and Martha Gable, and a half-dozen others whose faces he recognized. Their eyes filled with judgment. He was supposed to be a broken man, but standing there, in the middle of the street, he felt a strength he had never known. He was no longer just fighting for his land, he was fighting for her. "You all want my land so bad?" he called out, his voice ringing through the dusty street. "You want the progress the judge is selling you? Then you have to go through her." He pointed back at the judge's office. "He won't do it. He won't write her name on a deed because of her reputation." He looked directly at Henderson. "A reputation you helped build. Isn't that right? When you refused a good woman credit because of your own narrow mind." He then turned his gaze on Martha Gable. "A reputation you spat on in the street, hiding your own bitter heart behind your Bible." A murmur went through the crowd. He was saying the quiet things, the ugly things, out loud. He was holding up a mirror to them, and they did not like what they saw. "You call this a town of good, God-fearing people?" Luke's voice grew louder, filled with the righteous fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. "You hide in your houses and your church, and you whisper. You pass judgment on a woman whose strength and heart are worth more than this entire town put together. You are not good people. You are cowards." The sky above, which had been a clear, hard blue all day, was beginning to cloud over. A dark line of clouds was gathering on the western horizon, and the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the smell of rain and ozone. A storm was brewing, a real one, to match the one Luke had just unleashed in the heart of Dry Creek. He turned his back on the stunned, silent crowd and walked to his horse. He had made his stand. He had drawn his line in the sand. Now,
He and Clara would have to face the consequences. He mounted his horse and rode out of town, leaving a storm of anger and resentment in his wake. Riding toward the storm that was gathering in the sky, they would have to make a choice, and soon, stay and fight for a life in a town that hated them, or flee into the wilderness and start again. The storm broke just after sunset. It was a violent, furious thing. The sky torn open by jagged slashes of lightning, the wind a low, constant moan that seemed to rise from the wounded earth itself. Inside the cabin, a single lantern cast long, dancing shadows. The air was thick with the scent of pine tar from their repaired door and the quiet, final act of packing. Clara moved with a numb efficiency, folding their few spare clothes into a canvas sack. Her movements were precise, her face a calm, pale mask. But inside, her heart was a leaden weight. They were leaving, giving up. The town had won. Luke sat at the table, cleaning his rifle, a task he performed with a meticulous, dangerous focus that was more telling than any outburst of rage. His hands, usually so steady, were tight and white-knuckled on the oiled wood and steel. They had packed the last of the salted meat, the last bag of flour. Her small garden, just beginning to show the faint green of new life, would be left to the weeds and the wind. The cabin, which had been a prison and had become a sanctuary, would be left to the railroad, to progress, to Judge Miller's greed. Clara finished her task and looked at Luke. He had stopped cleaning the rifle and was staring out the small window, his gaze fixed on the land, visible only in the brief, stark flashes of lightning. He was not just looking at a patch of dirt and rock. He was looking at his life. "I buried my brother on that ridge," he said, his voice so low she could barely hear it over the wind. "My father broke this ground with his own 2 hands. Every rock we pulled from that soil to build this place, it cost us something. A piece of our back, a piece of our life." He turned from the window, his eyes dark with a pain that went deeper than any physical wound. To just walk away, to let them take it. He shook his head, unable to finish the thought. Clara went to him, her good hand resting on his shoulder. His muscles were knotted with tension. "This cabin is just wood and stone. Luke," she said softly, "the land is just dirt. Home is not a place. It's you." He reached up and covered her hand with his own, his thumb stroking her skin. A flicker of lightning illuminated his face, and she saw the glistening of unshed tears in his eyes. He could not bear to give up the land he had bled for, and she could not bear to watch it break him. A sudden, frantic pounding on the door made them both jump. It was not the knock of a neighbor or the fist of the law. It was something urgent, desperate. Luke moved in front of Clara, his hand resting on the butt of the pistol tucked into his belt. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice a low growl. "Luke, for God's sake, open the door. It's me, Sadie." The voice was unmistakable. Luke and Clara exchanged a look of disbelief. He drew the bolt and pulled the door open. The saloon singer stood on their porch, soaked to the skin, her scarlet dress plastered to her body, her painted face a mess of running mascara and rain. She looked not like a confident seductress, but like a half-drowned cat seeking shelter. "What do you want?" Luke asked, his tone hard, his body still blocking the entrance. "To help you, you stubborn fool," Sadie gasped, shivering. She pushed a length of oilcloth-wrapped parcel into his hands. "I heard what you did in town, what the judge said. I know Miller. I know his kind. He did the same thing in Dusty Gulch. A man I knew, a good man, lost everything." Luke unwrapped the oilcloth. Inside, protected from the rain, was a deed. It was for a large parcel of land south of Dry Creek, the same land the railroad was set to buy. But the name on it was not the homesteader who had lived there. The name was Judge Thaddeus Miller, and beside it, another document, a bill of sale, dated a year prior. showing the judge had bought the land for a pittance through a proxy, knowing the railroad was coming.
He's been buying up the land cheap, using threats and forged papers, then selling it to the railroad for a fortune, Sadie explained, her voice breathless. The original deed to this place is in the county records. This is the one he keeps in his office safe, his proof of ownership. I persuaded his clerk to let me borrow it.
Clara stared at her. The woman who had come to gloat, to wound her, had just handed them a weapon. "Why?" Clara asked. The word a whisper. "Why would you do this for us?" Sadie looked from Clara's shorn hair to the protective way Luke stood in front of her. A strange, sad smile touched her lips. "Because I hate men like Miller more than I ever disliked you," she said. "And because Luke, he was always a better man than he let on. He deserves better than to be run off his land by a snake in a fancy suit." She shivered again. "Now, are you going to let me in? I've got a bottle of whiskey in my saddlebag, and I think we could all use a drink." The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and the earth smelling of rain and new beginnings. Luke and Clara rode into town not as fugitives, but as arbiters of a justice the town had long forgotten. Sadie, her dress dried and her face repaired, rode with them. The town council was already in session in the back room of the saloon, a grim-faced collection of Dry Creek's most prominent citizens, including Mr. Henderson and Judge Miller himself. They were finalizing the legal paperwork for the seizure of the Mallory land. Luke walked in without knocking. Every man in the room turned to look at him, their expressions ranging from anger to surprise. "Mallory," the judge said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You are trespassing. This is an official meeting." "I'm here on official business," Luke said, his voice calm and steady. He walked to the head of the table and laid the two deeds down. "This is the deed to the old Johnson parcel, the one you're selling to the railroad. And this," he added, placing the second deed beside it, "is the real one, from the county records." A dead silence fell over the room. Judge Miller's face went from ruddy to a pasty white. He stared at the papers as if they were coiled rattlesnakes. This is a forgery," he stammered. "Is it?" Luke asked, his gaze sweeping over the other men in the room. "Or is this the truth of how you do business? Judge, how many other families have you cheated? How many other men have you threatened to get what you want?" Mr. Henderson picked up the deeds, his brow furrowed. He compared the signatures, the dates. The proof was undeniable. The man they had trusted, the man who represented the law, was a common thief. The judge saw the look in their eyes. He saw the respect for the law warring with the greed he had promised them. He saw that he had lost. In a sudden, desperate movement, he shoved his chair back and made a bolt for the back door. He didn't get far. The sheriff, who had been standing quietly in the corner, stepped into his path. The judge tried to push past him, but the old lawman's arm was like iron. With a quiet click, a pair of handcuffs snapped around Judge Miller's wrists. Justice, it turned out, was not a matter for a committee. It was the simple, final act of a good man doing his job. In the days that followed, the town treated Clara differently. When she walked down the street, the whispers stopped. People who had once looked through her now met her eye and gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was not friendship. It was a grudging, hard-won respect. But Clara found, to her surprise, that it no longer mattered. She had walked through their fire and had not been burned. She no longer needed their approval to feel whole. The railroad deal was renegotiated. Fairly this time, the money they received was enough to secure the deed to their own land. Free and clear, with enough left over to buy seed and a few head of cattle. The name on the new, official deed read, simply, Clara Mallory. Life settled into a new rhythm, one of peace and quiet purpose. Clara, true to her dream, turned the front part of their cabin into a tiny, one-room schoolhouse. The children came. The same ragged, barefoot children she had read to on the street. They were shy at first, but their eagerness to learn was a bright, beautiful thing. She taught them their letters from her mother's primer, showed them how to add and subtract using stones from the creek bed. The cabin, once a place of silence and sorrow, was now filled with the sound of their hesitant, hopeful voices. While she taught, Luke worked. He built a new, sturdy porch that wrapped around the front of the cabin, one large enough for 2 chairs. He repaired the barn, expanded the corral, and his small herd of cattle began to grow. Every evening, when the last child had gone home, he and Clara would sit together in the 2 chairs on their new porch. They would watch the sun set over the Badlands, the harsh landscape they had claimed as their own. They rarely spoke much. They did not need to. Their life was a conversation held in shared glances, in the comfortable space between their chairs, in the simple, steady fact of their presence in each other's lives. One night, as the first stars began to prick the deep velvet of the sky, Clara leaned her head against the porch post. A gentle breeze carried the scent of the marigolds she had finally managed to coax from the stubborn earth. The world felt peaceful, settled, but the old scars, the old fears, they never faded completely. She turned to Luke, her voice a soft whisper in the twilight. "Will you still want me tomorrow?" He did not answer right away. He reached over and took her hand, his familiar, rough hand enclosing hers. He looked out at the vast, dark expanse of the plains. Then he turned his eyes to her, and in their depth she saw a love as steady and as endless as the stars above. "Clara," he said, his voice quiet and sure, "I'll want you until the last dawn I see." The sun rose the next morning, as it always did, casting its golden light over the harsh western plains. The land was still cruel, the winters were still hard, and the summers still burned. But in a small cabin with a wide front porch, the love was real. And it stayed until morning. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We would love to hear your thoughts and where you are listening from in the comments below to connect with fellow travelers. And please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel for more tales from the frontier.